Chapter 24. Death and Love. Thomas Crich died slowly, terribly slowly. It seemed impossible to everybody that the thread of life could be drawn out so thin and yet not break. The sick man lay unutterably weak and spent, kept alive by morphia and by drinks, which he sipped slowly. He was only half conscious, a thin strand of consciousness linking the darkness of death with the light of day. Yet his will was unbroken. He was integral, complete. Only he must have perfect stillness about him. Any presence but that of the nurses was a strain and an effort to him now. Every morning Gerald went into the room, hoping to find his father passed away at last. Yet always he saw the same transparent face, the same dread dark hair on the waxen forehead, and the awful inchoate dark eyes, which seemed to be decomposing into formless darkness, having only a tiny grain of vision within them. And always, as the dark inchoate eyes turned to him, there passed through Gerald's bowels a burning stroke of revolt that seemed to resound through his whole being, threatening to break his mind with its clangour, and making him mad. Every morning the sun stood there, erect and taut with life, gleaming in his blondness. The gleaming blondness of his strange, immanent being put the father into a fever of fretful irritation. He could not bear to meet the uncanny, downward look of Gerald's blue eyes. But it was only for a moment. Each on the brink of departure, the father and son looked at each other, then parted. For a long time Gerald preserved a perfect sang-froid. He remained quite collected. But at last fear undermined him. He was afraid of some horrible collapse in himself. He had to stay and see this thing through. Some perverse will made him watch his father drawn over the borders of life. And yet now, every day, the great red-hot stroke of horrified fear through the bowels of the son struck a further inflammation. Gerald went about all day with a tendency to cringe, as if there were the point of a sword of Damocles pricking the nape of his neck. There was no escape. He was bound up with his father. He had to see him through. And the father's will never relaxed or yielded to death. It would have to snap when death at last snapped it, if it did not persist after a physical death. In the same way the will of the son never yielded. He stood firm and immune. He was outside this death and this dying. It was a trial by ordeal. Could he stand and see his father slowly dissolve and disappear in death, without once yielding his will, without once relenting before the omnipotence of death? Like a Red Indian undergoing torture, Gerald would experience the whole process of slow death, without wincing or flinching. He even triumphed in it. He somehow wanted this death, even forced it. It was as if he himself were dealing the death, even when he most recoiled in horror. Still he would deal it, he would triumph through death. But in the stress of this ordeal, Gerald too lost his hold on the outer daily life. That which was much to him came to mean nothing. Work, pleasure, it was all left behind. He went on more or less mechanically with his business, but this activity was all extraneous. The real activity was this ghastly wrestling for death in his own soul, and his own will should triumph. Come what might, he would not bow down, or submit, or acknowledge a master. He had no master in death. But as the fight went on, and all that he had been and was continued to be destroyed, so that life was a hollow shell all round him, roaring and clattering like the sound of the sea, a noise in which he participated externally. And inside this hollow shell was all the darkness and fearful space of death. He knew he would have to find reinforcements, otherwise he would collapse inwards upon the great dark void which circled at the centre of his soul. His will held his outer life, his outer mind, his outer being, unbroken and unchanged. But the pressure was too great. He would have to find something to make good the equilibrium. Something must come with him into the hollow void of death in his soul, fill it up, and so equalize the pressure within to the pressure without. For day by day he felt more and more like a bubble filled with darkness, round which whirled the iridescence of his consciousness, and upon which the pressure of the outer world, the outer life, roared vastly. In this extremity his instinct led him to Gudrun. He threw away everything now. He only wanted the relation established with her. He would follow her to the studio, to be near her, to talk to her. He would stand about the room, aimlessly picking up the implements, the lumps of clay, the little figures she had cast, they were whimsical and grotesque, looking at them without perceiving them. And she felt him following her, dogging her heels like a doom. She held away from him, and yet she knew he drew always a little nearer, a little nearer. "I say," he said to her one evening, in an odd, unthinking, uncertain way, "won't you stay to dinner tonight? I wish you would." She started slightly. He spoke to her like a man making a request of another man. "They'll be expecting me at home," she said. "Oh, they won't mind, will they?" he said. "I should be awfully glad if you'd stay." Her long silence gave consent at last. "I'll tell Thomas, shall I?" he said. "I must go almost immediately after dinner," she said. It was a dark, cold evening. There was no fire in the drawing-room. They sat in the library. He was mostly silent, absent, and Winifred talked a little. But when Gerald did rouse himself, he smiled, and was pleasant and ordinary with her. Then there came over him again the long blanks, of which he was not aware. She was very much attracted by him. He looked so preoccupied, and his strange blank silences, which she could not read, moved her, and made her wonder over him, made her feel reverential towards him. But he was very kind. He gave her the best things at the table. He had a bottle of slightly sweet, delicious golden wine brought out for dinner, knowing she would prefer it to the Burgundy. She felt herself esteemed, needed almost. As they took coffee in the library, there was a soft, very soft knocking at the door. He started and called, "Come in." The timbre of his voice, like something vibrating at high pitch, unnerved Gudrun. A nurse in white entered, half hovering in the doorway like a shadow. She was very good-looking, but strangely enough shy and self-mistrusting. "The doctor would like to speak to you, Mr. Crich," she said, in her low, discreet voice. "The doctor?" he said, starting up. "Where is he?" "He is in the dining-room." "Tell him I'm coming." He drank up his coffee and followed the nurse, who had dissolved like a shadow. "Which nurse was that?" asked Gudrun.
"Miss Inglis. I like her best,"
replied Winifred. After a while Gerald came back, looking absorbed by his own thoughts, and having some of that tension and abstraction which is seen in a slightly drunken man. He did not say what the doctor had wanted him for, but stood before the fire, with his hands behind his back, and his face open, and as if rapt. Not that he was really thinking. He was only arrested in pure suspense inside himself, and thoughts wafted through his mind without order.
"I must go now and see Mamma," said Winifred, "and see Dada before he goes to sleep."
She bade them both good night. Gudrun also rose to take her leave.
"You needn't go yet, need you?"
said Gerald, glancing quickly at the clock.
"It is early yet. I'll walk down with you when you go. Sit down. Don't hurry away."
Gudrun sat down as if, absent as he was, his will had power over her. She felt almost mesmerised. He was strange to her, something unknown. What was he thinking? What was he feeling as he stood there so rapt, saying nothing? He kept her, she could feel that. He would not let her go. She watched him in humble submissiveness. "Had the doctor anything new to tell you?" she asked softly, at length, with that gentle, timid sympathy which touched a keen fibre in his heart. He lifted his eyebrows with a negligent, indifferent expression. "No, nothing new," he replied, as if the question were quite casual, trivial. "He says the pulse is very weak indeed, very intermittent, but that doesn't necessarily mean much, you know." He looked down at her. Her eyes were dark and soft and unfolded, with a stricken look that roused him. "No," she murmured at length, "I don't understand anything about these things."
"Just as well not," he said. "I say, won't you have a cigarette? Do."
He quickly fetched the box and held her a light. Then he stood before her on the hearth again.
"No," he said. "We've never had much illness in the house either, not till father."
He seemed to meditate a while. Then, looking down at her, with strangely communicative blue eyes that filled her with dread, he continued,
"It's something you don't reckon with, you know, till it is there. And then you realise that it was there all the time. It was always there. You understand what I mean? The possibility of this incurable illness, this slow death."
He moved his feet uneasily on the marble hearth, and put his cigarette to his mouth, looking up at the ceiling. "I know," murmured Gudrun. "It is dreadful." He smoked without knowing. Then he took the cigarette from his lips, bared his teeth, and putting the tip of his tongue between his teeth, spat off a grain of tobacco, turning slightly aside, like a man who is alone, or who is lost in thought.
"I don't know what the effect actually is on one," he said.
And again he looked down at her. Her eyes were dark and stricken with knowledge, looking into his. He saw her submerged, and he turned aside his face.
"But I absolutely am not the same. There's nothing left, if you understand what I mean. You seem to be clutching at the void, and at the same time you avoid yourself. And so you don't know what to do."
"No," she murmured. A heavy thrill ran down her nerves, heavy, almost pleasure, almost pain. "What can be done?" she added. He turned and flipped the ash from his cigarette onto the great marble hearthstones that lay bare in the room, without fender or bar.
"I don't know, I'm sure," he replied. "But I do think you've got to find some way of resolving the situation. Not because you want to, but because you've got to, otherwise you're done. The whole of everything, and yourself included, is just on the point of caving in, and you're just holding it up with your hands. Well, it's a situation that obviously can't continue. You can't stand holding the roof up with your hands forever. You know that sooner or later you'll have to let go. Do you understand what I mean? And so something's got to be done, or there's a universal collapse, as far as you yourself are concerned."
He shifted slightly on the hearth, crunching a cinder under his heel. He looked down at it. Gudrun was aware of the beautiful old marble panels of the fireplace, swelling, softly carved, round him and above him. She felt as if she were caught at last by fate, imprisoned in some horrible and fatal trap. "But what can be done?" she murmured humbly. "You must use me if I can be of any help at all. But how can I? I don't see how I can help you." He looked down at her critically.
"I don't want you to help," he said, slightly irritated, "because there's nothing to be done. I only want sympathy, do you see? I want somebody I can talk to sympathetically. That eases the strain. And there is nobody to talk to sympathetically. That's the curious thing. There is nobody. There's Rupert Birkin, but then he isn't sympathetic. He wants to dictate. And that is no use whatsoever." She was caught in a strange snare. She looked down at her hands. Then there was the sound of the door softly opening. Gerald started. He was chagrined. It was his starting that really startled Gudrun. Then he went forward with quick, graceful, intentional courtesy. "Oh, mother," he said, "how nice of you to come down. How are you?"
The elderly woman, loosely and bulkily wrapped in a purple gown, came forward silently, slightly hulked as usual. Her son was at her side. He pushed her up a chair, saying, "You know Miss Brangwen, don't you?" The mother glanced at Gudrun indifferently. "Yes," she said. Then she turned her wonderful forget-me-not blue eyes up to her son, as she slowly sat down in the chair he had brought her. "I came to ask you about your father," she said, in her rapid, scarcely audible voice. "I didn't know you had company."
"No? Didn't Winifred tell you? Miss Brangwen stayed to dinner to make us a little more lively."
Mrs Crich turned slowly round to Gudrun, and looked at her, but with unseeing eyes. "I'm afraid it would be no treat to her." Then she turned again to her son. "Winifred tells me the doctor had something to say about your father. What is it?"
"Only that the pulse is very weak. Misses altogether a good many times, so that he might not last the night out," Gerald replied.
Mrs Crich sat perfectly impassive, as if she had not heard. Her bulk seemed hunched in the chair, her fair hair hung slack over her ears. But her skin was clear and fine, her hands, as she sat with them forgotten and folded, were quite beautiful, full of potential energy. A great mass of energy seemed decaying up in that silent, hulking form. She looked up at her son, as he stood keen and soldierly near to her. Her eyes were most wonderfully blue, bluer than forget-me-nots. She seemed to have a certain confidence in Gerald, and to feel a certain motherly mistrust of him. "How are you?" she muttered in her strangely quiet voice, as if nobody should hear but him. "You're not getting into a state, are you? You're not letting it make you hysterical?" A curious challenge in the last words startled Gudrun. "I don't think so, mother," he answered, rather coldly cheery. "Somebody's got to see it through, you know."
Have they? Have they?" answered his mother rapidly. "Why should you take it on yourself? What have you got to do seeing it through? It will see itself through. You're not needed."
"No, I don't suppose I can do any good," he answered. "It's just how it affects us, you see."
"You like to be affected, don't you? It's quite nuts for you. You would have to be important. You have no need to stop at home. Why don't you go away?"
These sentences, evidently the ripened grain of many dark hours, took Gerald by surprise.
"I don't think it's any good going away now, mother, at the last minute," he said coldly.
"You take care," replied his mother. "You mind yourself. That's your business. You take too much on yourself. You mind yourself, or you'll find yourself in Queer Street. That's what will happen to you. You're hysterical, always were."
"I'm all right, mother," he said. "There's no need to worry about me, I assure you."
"Let the dead bury their dead. Don't go and bury yourself along with them. That's what I tell you. I know you well enough."
He did not answer this, not knowing what to say. The mother sat bunched up in silence, her beautiful white hands, that had no rings whatsoever, clasping the pommels of her armchair.
"You can't do it,"
she said almost bitterly.
"You haven't the nerve. You're as weak as a cat, really, always were. Is this young woman staying here?"
"No," said Gerald. "She is going home tonight."
"Then she'd better have the dog-cart. Does she go far?"
"Only to Beldover."
"Ah."
The elderly woman never looked at Gudrun, yet she seemed to take knowledge of her presence.
"You are inclined to take too much on yourself, Gerald,"
said the mother, pulling herself to her feet with a little difficulty.
"Will you go, mother?" he asked politely.
"Yes, I'll go up again," she replied.
Turning to Gudrun, she bade her
"Good night."
Then she went slowly to the door, as if she were unaccustomed to walking. At the door, she lifted her face to him implicitly. He kissed her.
"Don't come any further with me,"
she said in her barely audible voice.
"I don't want you any further."
He bade her good night, watched her across to the stairs and mount slowly. Then he closed the door and came back to Gudrun. Gudrun rose also, to go.
"A queer being, my mother," he said.
"Yes," replied Gudrun.
"She has her own thoughts."
"Yes," said Gudrun. Then they were silent.
"You want to go?" he asked. "Half a minute, I'll just have a horse put in."
"No," said Gudrun, "I want to walk." He had promised to walk with her down the long lonely mile of drive, and she wanted this.
"You might just as well drive," he said.
"I'd much rather walk," she asserted with emphasis.
"You would? Then I will come along with you. You know where your things are? I'll put boots on."
He put on a cap and an overcoat over his evening dress. They went out into the night.
"Let us light a cigarette," he said,
stopping in a sheltered angle of the porch.
"You have one too."
So, with the scent of tobacco on the night air, they set off down the dark drive that ran between close-cut hedges through sloping meadows. He wanted to put his arm around her. If he could put his arm round her and draw her against him as they walked, he would, equilibrate himself. For now he felt like a pair of scales, the half of which tips down and down into an indefinite void. He must recover some sort of balance. And here was the hope and the perfect recovery. Blind to her, thinking only of himself, he slipped his arm softly round her waist and drew her to him. Her heart fainted, feeling herself taken. But then his arm was so strong, she quailed under its powerful, close grasp. She died a little death, and was drawn against him as they walked down the stormy darkness. He seemed to balance her perfectly in opposition to himself, in their dual motion of walking. So suddenly he was liberated and perfect, strong, heroic. He put his hand to his mouth and threw his cigarette away, a gleaming point, into the unseen hedge. Then he was quite free to balance her. "That's better," he said with exultancy. The exultation in his voice was like a sweetish, poisonous drug to her. Did she then mean so much to him? She sipped the poison. "Are you happier?" she asked wistfully. "Much better," he said, in the same exultant voice. "And I was rather far gone." She nestled against him. He felt her all soft and warm. She was the rich, lovely substance of his being. The warmth and motion of her walk suffused through him wonderfully. "I'm so glad if I help you," she said. "Yes," he answered. "There's nobody else could do it, if you wouldn't." "That is true," she said to herself, with a thrill of strange, fatal elation. As they walked, he seemed to lift her nearer and nearer to himself, till she moved upon the firm vehicle of his body. He was so strong, so sustaining, and he could not be opposed. She drifted along in a wonderful interfusion of physical motion down the dark, blowy hillside. Far across shone the little yellow lights of Beldover, many of them, spread in a thick patch on another dark hill. But he and she were walking in perfect, isolated darkness, outside the world. "But how much do you care for me?" came her voice, almost querulous. "You see, I don't know, I don't understand." "How much?" His voice rang with a painful elation. "I don't know either, but everything." He was startled by his own declaration. It was true. So he stripped himself of every safeguard in making this admission to her. He cared everything for her. She was everything. "But I can't believe it," said her low voice, amazed, trembling. She was trembling with doubt and exultance. This was the thing she wanted to hear, only this. Yet now she heard it, heard the strange clapping vibration of truth in his voice as he said it. She could not believe. She could not believe. She did not believe. Yet she believed, triumphantly, with fatal exultance. "Why not?" he said. "Why don't you believe it? It's true. It is true as we stand at this moment." He stood still with her in the wind. "I care for nothing on earth or in heaven outside this spot where we are. And it isn't my own presence I care about, it is all yours. I'd sell my soul 100 times, but I couldn't bear not to have you here. I couldn't bear to be alone. My brain would burst. It is true." He drew her closer to him with definite movement. "No, she murmured, afraid. Yet this was what she wanted. Why did she so lose courage? They resumed their strange walk. They were such strangers, and yet they were so frightfully, unthinkably near. It was like a madness. Yet it was what she wanted. It was what she wanted. They had descended the hill, and now they were coming to the square arch where the road passed under the colliery railway. The arch, Gudrun knew, had walls of squared stone, mossy on one side, with water that trickled down, dry on the other side. She had stood under it to hear the train rumble thundering over the logs overhead. And she knew that under this dark and lonely bridge the young colliers stood in the darkness with their sweethearts in rainy weather. And so she wanted to stand under the bridge with her sweetheart, and be kissed under the bridge in the invisible darkness. Her steps dragged as she drew near. So, under the bridge, they came to a standstill, and he lifted her upon his breast. His body vibrated taut and powerful as he closed upon her, and crushed her, breathless and dazed and destroyed, crushed her upon his breast. Oh, it was terrible and perfect. Under this bridge the colliers pressed their lovers to their breast, and now under the bridge the master of them all pressed her to himself. And how much more powerful and terrible was his embrace than theirs, how much more concentrated and supreme his love was than theirs in the same sort. She felt she would swoon, die, under the vibrating, inhuman tension of his arms and his body. She would pass away. Then the unthinkable high vibration slackened and became more undulating. He slackened and drew her with him to stand with his back to the wall. She was almost unconscious. So the colliers' lovers would stand with their backs to the walls, holding their sweethearts and kissing them as she was being kissed. Ah, but would their kisses be fine and powerful as the kisses of the firm-mouthed master? Even the keen, short-cut moustache, the colliers would not have that. And the colliers' sweethearts would, like herself, hang their heads back, limp over their shoulder, and look out from the dark archway at the close patch of yellow lights on the unseen hill in the distance, or at the vague form of trees, and at the buildings of the colliery woodyard in the other direction. His arms were fast around her. He seemed to be gathering her into himself, her warmth, her softness, her adorable weight, drinking in the suffusion of her physical being, avidly. He lifted her, and seemed to pour her into himself, like wine into a cup. "This is worth everything," he said, in a strange, penetrating voice. So she relaxed, and seemed to melt, to flow into him, as if she were some infinitely warm and precious suffusion filling into his veins, like an intoxicant. Her arms were round his neck. He kissed her and held her perfectly suspended. She was all slack and flowing into him, and he was the firm, strong cup that receives the wine of her life. So she lay cast upon him, stranded, lifted up against him, melting and melting under his kisses, melting into his limbs and bones, as if he were soft iron becoming surcharged with her electric life. Till she seemed to swoon, gradually her mind went, and she passed away, everything in her was melted down and fluid, and she lay still, become contained by him, sleeping in him as lightning sleeps in a pure soft stone. So she was passed away and gone in him, and he was perfected. When she opened her eyes again, and saw the patch of lights in the distance, it seemed to her strange that the world still existed, that she was standing under the bridge resting her head on Gerald's breast. Gerald, who was he? He was the exquisite adventure, the desirable unknown to her. She looked up, and in the darkness saw his face above her, his shapely male face. There seemed a faint white light emitted from him, a white aura, as if he were visitor from the unseen. She reached up, like Eve reaching to the apples on the tree of knowledge, and she kissed him, though her passion was a transcendent fear of the thing he was, touching his face with her infinitely delicate, encroaching, wondering fingers. Her fingers went over the mould of his face, over his features. How perfect and foreign he was! Ah, how dangerous! Her soul thrilled with complete knowledge. This was the glistening, forbidden apple, this face of a man. She kissed him, putting her fingers over his face, his eyes, his nostrils, over his brows and his ears, to his neck, to know him, to gather him in by touch. He was so firm and shapely, with such satisfying, inconceivable shapeliness, strange yet unutterably clear. He was such an unutterable enemy, yet glistening with uncanny white fire. She wanted to touch him and touch him and touch him, till she had him all in her hands, till she had strained him into her knowledge. Ah, if she could have the precious knowledge of him, she would be filled, and nothing could deprive her of this. For he was so unsure, so risky in the common world of day. "You are so beautiful," she murmured in her throat. He wondered, and was suspended, but she felt him quiver, and she came down involuntarily nearer upon him. He could not help himself. Her fingers had him under their power. The fathomless, fathomless desire they could evoke in him was deeper than death, where he had no choice. But she knew now, and it was enough. For the time, her soul was destroyed with the exquisite shock of his invisible fluid lightning. She knew. And this knowledge was a death from which she must recover. How much more of him was there to know? Ah, much, much, many days harvesting for her large yet perfectly subtle and intelligent hands upon the field of his living, radioactive body. Oh, her hands were eager, greedy for knowledge. But for the present it was enough, enough, as much as her soul could bear. Too much, and she would shatter herself. She would fill the fine vial of her soul too quickly, and it would break. Enough now, enough for the time being. There were all the after days when her hands, like birds, could feed upon the fields of his mystical plastic form. Till then, enough. And even he was glad to be checked, rebuked, held back. For to desire is better than to possess. The finality of the end was dreaded as deeply as it was desired. They walked on towards the town, towards where the lamps threaded singly, at long intervals, down the dark high road of the valley. They came at length to the gate of the drive. "Don't come any further," she said.
"You'd rather I didn't?"
he asked, relieved. He did not want to go up the public streets with her, his soul all naked and alight as it was. "Much rather. Good night." She held out her hand. He grasped it, then touched the perilous, potent fingers with his lips.
"Good night,"
he said.
"Tomorrow."
And they parted. He went home full of the strength and the power of living desire. But the next day she did not come. She sent a note that she was kept indoors by a cold. Here was a torment. But he possessed his soul in some sort of patience, writing a brief answer, telling her how sorry he was not to see her. The day after this he stayed at home. It seemed so futile to go down to the office. His father could not live the week out, and he wanted to be at home, suspended. Gerald sat on a chair by the window in his father's room. The landscape outside was black and winter-sodden. His father lay grey and ashen on the bed. A nurse moved silently in her white dress, neat and elegant, even beautiful. There was a scent of eau de cologne in the room. The nurse went out of the room. Gerald was alone with death, facing the winter-black landscape. "Is there much more water in Denley?" came the faint voice, determined and querulous, from the bed. The dying man was asking about a leakage from Willey Water into one of the pits. "Some more. We shall have to run off the lake," said Gerald. "Will you?" The faint voice filtered to extinction. There was dead stillness. The grey-faced sick man lay with eyes closed, more dead than death. Gerald looked away. He felt his heart was seared. It would perish if this went on much longer. Suddenly he heard a strange noise. Turning round, he saw his father's eyes wide open, strained and rolling in a frenzy of inhuman struggling. Gerald started to his feet and stood transfixed in horror. Came a horrible, choking rattle from his father's throat, the fearful, frenzied eye, rolling awfully in its wild, fruitless search for help, passed blindly over Gerald, then up came the dark blood and mess, pumping over the face of the agonised being. The tense body relaxed. The head fell aside down the pillow. Gerald stood transfixed, his soul echoing in horror. He would move, but he could not. He could not move his limbs. His brain seemed to re-echo like a pulse. The nurse in white softly entered. She glanced at Gerald, then at the bed. "Oh!" came her soft, whimpering cry, and she hurried forward to the dead man. "Oh!" came the slight sound of her agitated distress, as she stood bending over the bedside. Then she recovered, turned, and came for towel and sponge. She was wiping the dead face carefully, and murmuring, almost whimpering, very softly, "Poor Mr. Crich, poor Mr. Crich, poor Mr. Crich." "Is he dead?" clanged Gerald's sharp voice. "Oh yes, he's gone," replied the soft, moaning voice of the nurse, as she looked up at Gerald's face. She was young and beautiful and quivering. A strange sort of grin went over Gerald's face, over the horror, and he walked out of the room. He was going to tell his mother. On the landing he met his brother Basil. "He's gone, Basil," he said, scarcely able to subdue his voice, not to let an unconscious, frightening exultation sound through. "What?" cried Basil, going pale. Gerald nodded. Then he went on to his mother's room. She was sitting in her purple gown, sewing, very slowly sewing, putting in a stitch, then another stitch. She looked up at Gerald with her blue, undaunted eyes. "Father's gone," he said.
"He's dead? Who says so?"
"Oh, you know, mother, if you see him." She put her sewing down and slowly rose. "Are you going to see him?" he asked.
"Yes," she said.
By the bedside the children already stood in a weeping group.
"Oh, mother!"
cried the daughters, almost in hysterics, weeping loudly. But the mother went forward. The dead man lay in repose, as if gently asleep, so gently, so peacefully, like a young man sleeping in purity. He was still warm. She stood looking at him in gloomy, heavy silence for some time. "Ay," she said bitterly at length, speaking as if to the unseen witnesses of the air.
"You're dead."
She stood for some minutes in silence, looking down.
"Beautiful," she asserted. "Beautiful as if life had never touched you. Never touched you. God send I look different. I hope I shall look my years when I am dead. Beautiful, beautiful," she crooned over him. "You can see him in his teens with his first beard on his face. A beautiful soul. Beautiful." Then there was a tearing in her voice as she cried, "None of you look like this when you are dead. Don't let it happen again."
It was a strange, wild command from out of the unknown. Her children moved unconsciously together, in a nearer group, at the dreadful command in her voice. The colour was flushed bright in her cheek. She looked awful and wonderful. Blame me if you like, that he lies there like a lad in his teens, with his first beard on his face. Blame me if you like, but you none of you know." She was silent in intense silence. Then there came, in a low, tense voice, "If I thought that the children I bore would lie looking like that in death, I'd strangle them when they were infants, yes." "No, mother," came the strange clarion voice of Gerald from the background. "We're different. We don't blame you." She turned and looked full in his eyes. Then she lifted her hands in a strange half gesture of mad despair. "Pray," she said strongly, "pray for yourselves to God, for there's no help for you from your parents." "Oh, mother!" cried her daughters wildly. But she had turned and gone, and they all went quickly away from each other. End of the first part of chapter